In August 1914, Europe was shaken by an unprecedented shock. Only weeks after the assassination in Sarajevo, a tangled web of alliances turned a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. The German Empire unleashed the Schlieffen Plan, aiming to smash through Belgium in a matter of days and collapse Paris with a lightning blow. Meanwhile, the British Empire, hoping to avoid a continental war, was forced into the conflict the moment Germany violated Belgian neutrality. That decision would reshape the fate of Europe and pull Britain into the largest war in its history. On August 4, 1914, Britain formally declared war on Germany. Immediately, the British Expeditionary Force, BEEF, was ordered to mobilize and cross the Channel. Small in number but unmatched in professionalism, the BEF fielded only about 80,000 troops. But they were elite riflemen and veteran officers hardened by campaigns in South Africa, India, Sudan, and across Britain's sprawling empire. Disciplined, precise, and deadly under pressure, they were one of the finest professional armies in the world. While the British crossed the Channel, Belgium was collapsing. Germany hurled two massive armies, over 1 million men, into the campaign. After Liège fell, they advanced like a storm across golden wheat fields and quiet villages. The Belgians fought bravely, but they were no match for German heavy artillery, machine guns, and meticulously organized assault formations. Each day, the footsteps of Germany's hammer of steel marched closer to the French border. The French army, struggling at Lorraine and the Ardennes, desperately needed the BEF to secure the vulnerable right flank. Without the British, Von Kluck's gigantic First Army could sweep down from the north, strike the French from behind, and trigger a strategic disaster. On August 14th, the first BEF units arrived at Le Havre and Boulogne. Huge transport ships unloaded British troops in khaki uniforms and worn kepi caps, soon to be replaced by steel helmets. French civilians lined the streets, cheering for the Tommies, the affectionate nickname for British soldiers. For the first time in days, France felt a spark of hope. The Allies from across the sea had arrived, bringing what felt like a lifeline against the iron tide rushing toward them. The BEF was commanded by Field Marshal John French, experienced but cautious. Beneath him were two corps, I Corps under Douglas Haig and Secu Corps under Horace Smith Dorrien, both proven commanders with decades of field experience. Their soldiers, though few, possessed a lethal skill. A trained British rifleman with a Lee Enfield could fire 15 accurate rounds per minute, so fast and dense that German troops often mistook it for machine gun fire. On August 20th, the BEF marched into Belgium. They passed through quiet villages and narrow roads where the war had not yet left its scars. But the atmosphere quickly changed. Refugees poured down the roads, telling stories of burning towns and German columns descending like a black tide. The soldiers of the BEF now understood. The enemy they were about to face was not only vast, but relentless and terrifying. On August 22nd, the BEF received its first major mission: block the advance of Germany's First Army along the line between Mons and Condé. A long, winding canal offered a natural defensive line. The BEF was ordered to hold it in coordination with the French. If the British failed, the entire Allied right flank would collapse. By late afternoon, British troops had dug in. Trenches were carved into the canal bank, barbed wire strung up, rifle pits prepared. The men stared across the calm water of the Mons-Condé Canal, knowing it would soon become a crucible of fire. Across the fields, the Germans were coming. Von Kluck's First Army, over 160,000 strong, twice the size of the BEF, advanced with heavy artillery and Maxim machine guns. Many German officers believed the small British force was a minor obstacle, a speed bump on the road to Paris. They were wrong. The BEF, though small, was as deadly as any army in Europe. Its discipline, marksmanship, and leadership would turn what Germany expected to be an easy breakthrough into a nightmare that echoed throughout the first months of the war. The night of August 22nd settled over Mons with an eerie calm, the silence before the storm. British soldiers cleaned their rifles, fixed bayonets, tightened their kit straps, and watched the faint glow of lamps flicker across the town. None of them knew they were hours away from becoming the first British troops to face the full force of Germany's war machine, nor that the battle ahead would become legend, a testament to courage, discipline, and the iron will of a small army standing against a giant. At dawn on August 23, 1914, a thin veil of mist draped the hills around Mons, like a white shroud before an execution. British soldiers lined the canal bank, listening to the distant echoes drifting down from the north. The rumble of boots, the clatter of equipment, the grinding of wheels, and shouted orders bouncing through the morning air. It was no illusion. It was the unmistakable sign of a massive force descending upon them. The German First Army under General Alexander von Kluck. Around 9 a.m., the first German shells slammed into the small villages around Mons. Houses shook, roof tiles shattered, and the blast waves rolled through the ground itself, reminding the British troops that they were facing an enemy superior in both numbers and firepower. Even so, the British remained calm. They crouched low in the trenches dug the night before, checking their Lee-Enfield rifles, trusted weapons they knew would not fail them. The Germans began deploying infantry in wide formations, advancing in waves. Their numbers were so overwhelming that British observers on higher ground described them as a dark river of men pouring across the fields. Many German units assumed they were facing poorly trained militia, since Britain's appearance on the European continent was still a surprise to them. That confidence evaporated instantly. When the German lines closed into effective range, the first volleys of British rifle fire sliced through the air. Soldiers trained in the famed 15 shots a minute unleashed a wall of bullets so dense that German troops believed they were being hit by machine guns. Entire German ranks fell like wheat before a steel scythe. Officers leading the advance were gunned down rapidly, throwing the lines behind them into confusion. The Nimy Bridge became the most brutal flashpoint of the day. It was a crucial crossing over the Mons-Condé Canal, and the Germans committed elite units to seize it. Defending the opposite bank were the riflemen of the Royal Fusiliers, only a few hundred strong, but fighting with extraordinary ferocity. German machine guns raked their positions, but the British answered with steady, precise fire. Every shot carried a message. Not one man crosses this bridge. As the hours passed, the Germans fed more troops into the attack. Regiment after regiment surged forward, while shells burst across the water's surface. Some British positions were pressed so close that soldiers had to resort to bayonets to hold the line. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the BEF held firm. The British did not yield a single yard willingly, even as casualties mounted. Further west at Aubourg, the Middlesex Regiment faced an even more overwhelming assault. Thousands of German troops advanced across open fields, exposed to the deadly rifle fire pouring from the canal bank. The volume of bullets was so intense that German witnesses later recalled that it was impossible to lift one's head without being hit. Officers tried to rally their men to push across, only to be met by the cold precision of British marksmen. Still, the Germans refused to break. With sheer numbers and relentless pressure, they pushed forward inch by inch. Shortly after midday, German artillery intensified its bombardment of central Mons, forcing some British units to abandon dangerously exposed positions. Fires erupted throughout the town, sending columns of black smoke curling into the gray sky, a terrifying image of modern war. By about 3 p.m., the Germans finally managed to cross the canal at several points, particularly near Nimy Bridge. 2 platoons of the Royal Fusiliers fought to the last round. Many died where they stood, but the toll they inflicted was staggering. Hundreds of German bodies lay strewn on both sides of the crossing. Their sacrifice earned them respect from both allies and enemies alike. To the east of Mons, German units tried to flank the British line. The BF command realized that if the army were fully encircled, it could be destroyed in a single battle. Commanders sent urgent messages to headquarters warning that the pressure was escalating beyond what they could sustain. Field Marshal Sir John French initially believed the BEF could hold longer, but reports from Haig and Smith-Dorrien made the reality unmistakable. German artillery fire was intensifying rapidly. Positions along the canal were beginning to buckle under Maxim machine gun bursts. Yet the British resolve never wavered. With a tiny force, they had held off a massively superior army for hours. inflicted heavy casualties, and disrupted the entire timetable of von Kluck's advance. The German commander was furious. He could not comprehend how such a small force had delayed the First Army, something Belgium had been unable to do at Liège. By late afternoon, one truth was undeniable. The Mons-Condé canal line could not be held any longer. British units were being pushed back in sections, casualties were rising steeply, and German artillery had overpowered the BEF's defensive fire. If the British did not retreat soon, they risked encirclement and annihilation. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the air glowed with a haze of blood and smoke. Exhausted but still disciplined, British soldiers watched German troops tightening their grip on the far bank. A new chapter of the Battle of Mons was beginning, one of strategic withdrawal, iron discipline, and a grueling retreat that would enter the legend of the BEF. As the evening of August 23, 1914 settled over the battlefield, gunfire still echoed along the Mons-Condé Canal, heavy, uneven bursts that rolled across the water like thunder. But by now, the British commanders understood the brutal truth. The BEF could no longer hold. German forces had crossed the canal at multiple points. Their artillery was smothering nearly every defensive position, and more German troops were pouring in like an unstoppable flood of steel. A painful but unavoidable decision was made. The BEF would withdraw. That moment marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable fighting retreats in British military history. A disciplined, controlled withdrawal in which, despite facing an enemy several times their number, the BEF maintained its cohesion, its discipline, and its fighting spirit, leaving the Germans both stunned and impressed. The withdrawal order was issued shortly before 5 p.m. Officers rushed to pass it down the line, company by company, platoon by platoon, men who had clung to their trenches since dawn. Many British soldiers felt a tight knot in their chests as they received the order. They had fought all day, forcing the Germans to pay dearly for every yard gained. But war is not only about holding ground, it is also about preserving the strength to keep fighting another day. The first units pulled back from the left flank, where German pressure was heaviest. They slipped through narrow roads, moved through neighborhoods, orchards, and cornfields, trying to get out of the direct arc of German artillery. But the retreat was far from peaceful. German scouts shadowed their every move, weaving through thickets and small wooded patches, calling down artillery fire on suspected withdrawal routes. In central Mons, the situation was even more dangerous. Companies of the Royal Fusiliers, the Middlesex Regiment, and the Royal Scots found themselves partially cut off by German units that had crossed the canal. British officers were forced to make split-second decisions to prevent their units from collapsing. Several platoons were ordered to stay behind and hold off the Germans, fighting to the last cartridge, to buy time for others to escape. These rearguard sacrifices, tragic as they were, laid the foundation for the legend of the British at Mons. As night fell, the BEF began pulling back toward the Bavay-Maubeuge line. Dusty country roads filled with the footsteps of thousands of exhausted troops. Lanterns flickered in the dark as medical units tended to the wounded, their dim light casting long shadows across weary faces. Every soldier carried a heavy pack, a Lee Enfield rifle, and sometimes even the body of a fallen comrade they refused to abandon. Scattered groups of British troops struggled through the outskirts of Mons, trying to rejoin their regiments. Some were cut off when retreat routes were shelled by German artillery. Others had to fight their way out with bayonets after being surrounded. Yet despite the chaos, most of them reassembled with their units before dawn, a testament to the BEF's extraordinary discipline and organization. The Germans pursued relentlessly. Furious at the slow progress on the 23rd, General von Kluck ordered an immediate night offensive. German cavalry pushed down narrow roads, attempting to cut off the British retreat. But British and French cavalry fired back, triggering fierce firefights in the darkness. German flares lit the night sky as they searched for British columns. Several units were forced onto winding village paths to avoid being trapped. At dawn on August 24th, the BEF continued moving south. But now the pressure came not only from the north, it pressed from both flanks. German attacks grew sharper and more coordinated, raising a real fear of encirclement. After receiving grim reports from Haig and Smith-Dorrien, Field Marshal Sir John French recognized that if the BEF held its ground another day, it could be crushed outright. He ordered a further withdrawal toward Le Cateau and the lowlands to the south. The retreat quickly became a test of endurance. Many soldiers marched more than 30 kilometers, close to collapse, trudging through mud, ruined towns, and forests where German patrols prowled dangerously near. Yet in those desperate hours, the steel of the British Army shone brightest. No unit abandoned its position without orders. No gun was left behind if it could still be hauled by men or horses. Some companies, reduced to only a few dozen men, still marched in tight formation as if at full strength. This organized, stubborn retreat caused major problems for the Germans. Despite superior numbers and heavier artillery, they could not break the BEF's cohesion. Many German officers were astonished to find that even while falling back, the British fought fiercely at every small rearguard position. This slowed the German advance and disrupted von Kluck's timetable. Throughout August 24th, British formations gradually regrouped at temporary defensive positions. Some units arrived with barely half their original strength, but they arrived with honor. They had fought under overwhelming pressure for 2 days, then marched dozens of miles without losing their discipline, a feat military historians would later call a masterpiece of modern fighting withdrawal. As the night of August 24th settled over the fields of northern France, the BEF had escaped destruction for the moment. But they knew what was coming. The retreat was far from over. The Germans were closing in faster than ever, and a new battle, one even bloodier, was about to erupt at Le Cateau. At dawn on August 26, 1914, before the sun had even broken the horizon, the thunder of German artillery rolled across the fields around Le Cateau. This was where General Smith-Dorrien and his Second Corps of the British Expeditionary Force had been cornered, unable to withdraw quickly enough under the relentless pace of the German advance. While most of the BEF continued retreating south, Smith-Dorrien alone faced the very real possibility of being crushed by a vastly superior enemy force. And so he made the boldest decision of his military career: stand and fight, hold back the Germans at any cost, even if it meant sacrificing his entire corps. That decision not only saved the BEF from encirclement, but also became one of the most heroic chapters in British military history. The night before the battle, exhausted British soldiers fell asleep the moment they hit the ground, lying amid the sounds of rumbling wagons, shouted orders, and the glow of burning villages in the distance. They had fought at Mons, marched more than 30 kilometers in 2 days, and now waited for the Germans who were closing in by the minute. Yet when the order to fight was issued, no one hesitated. Smith-Dorrien moved along the lines, studying the hardened, determined faces around him, knowing these were the men capable of holding back the German tide. At 6 a.m., the battle erupted with one of the most furious artillery bombardments the British had faced so far in the campaign. Shells screamed overhead, slammed into the shallow improvised trenches, and sent fountains of earth cascading skyward. Men were thrown from their positions, but the barrage did not break Second Corps. They pressed themselves into roadside embankments and furrows, waiting for their moment to fire back. When German infantry advanced in broad sweeping waves, the British responded with the weapon they knew best: the Lee Enfield rifle. From the defense lines at Caudry, Inchy, and Le Cateau, thousands of British riflemen unleashed a storm of fire at astonishing speed. Once again, the density and precision of British rifle fire stunned the Germans. Units accustomed to overwhelming their opponents by sheer numbers now found themselves staggered by the cold, disciplined marksmanship of the BEF. But Le Cateau was not Mons. Mons had offered a canal as a natural defensive line. Le Cateau offered only open fields and gentle slopes, terrain nearly perfect for German artillery to inflict maximum destruction. German 77mm guns pounded the British relentlessly, smashing batteries, tearing apart infantry positions, and blowing entire companies to pieces. British artillery was forced to lower their guns and fire point blank as German troops closed in, creating some of the most brutal direct-fire duels of the war's opening months. By mid-morning, the situation had grown desperate. British regiments at Flers and Audincourt came under crushing pressure as fresh German units surged into the attack. Gray-coated ranks emerged from the morning haze like a massive steel tide. Still, the British held. Half-strength companies fought on with grim determination, every shot fired with the calm precision of seasoned professionals. In several places, the Germans pushed so close that the British had to resort to bayonets. Shouts, the clash of steel, and rifle cracks echoed across the fields. Some British companies were surrounded but fought to the last man. Acts of defiance that would later become ingrained in the military lore of the BEF. But the pressure was simply too great. Around 11 a.m., Smith-Dorrien realized that if he did not begin withdrawing immediately, Houcourt might be annihilated. He issued the exceedingly difficult order to conduct a fighting retreat, pull back in waves while maintaining resistance. Thanks to unwavering discipline, the British carried out this complex maneuver almost flawlessly. British artillery poured fire into the advancing Germans to shield the infantry's withdrawal. Many batteries fought until they were completely out of ammunition, destroying their guns on the spot rather than allow them to fall into German hands. Cavalry units held the flanks, battling German pressure with tenacity. Field hospitals were dismantled in haste, surgeons and nurses treating the wounded even as they moved. The withdrawal from Le Cateau was not a rout. It was a military masterpiece. Each battalion fell back in stages. Each platoon held its ground until the last possible moment. And every officer understood that every minute they bought would help the BEF escape disaster. Despite relentless pressure, the Germans could not break the British line. The BEF's resilience astonished German troops, who were used to crushing opponents by sheer mass. Several German reports later described the British as the most remarkable riflemen we had ever encountered. By late afternoon, gunfire began to fade. Despite heavy casualties, the majority of the BEF's Second Corps had escaped intact. They left behind 7,800 casualties, a staggering loss for such a small force. But they achieved something history would never forget. They prevented the Germans from smashing the BEF entirely, saved the Allied right flank, and bought the time France needed to form a new defensive line along the River Marne. That night, August 26th, the surviving British soldiers, exhausted to the bone, slept on damp grass south of the battlefield. They had endured Mons. They had survived Le Cateau. And now they understood that this war would not end quickly. Ahead of them lay the great retreat to the Marne, a journey in which every step could be their last. As the sunset of August 26, 1914 settled over Le Cateau, the battlefield still hung heavy with the haze of gunpowder and the scorched smell of churned earth. The last surviving elements of Second Corps pulled away from their fighting positions in a controlled chaos, leaving behind battered trenches, wrecked guns sabotaged to prevent capture, and fallen comrades lying across the torn fields. But the struggle for the BEF's survival was far from over. Though they had escaped Le Cateau, the entire British force was still being pursued by an enemy vastly stronger in numbers and momentum. That very night, the BEF received grim news. German forces were pressing hard from Cambrai and Valenciennes, trying to cut off the British retreat to the south. British formations were stretched thin across a wide front, many units scattered by the chaos of combat and the frantic pace of withdrawal. Yet through sheer discipline, they quickly reorganized. Detached groups rejoining like rivulets merging into a single determined stream flowing toward the lower valley of the Oise. On August 27th, as the first light washed over the dusty roads of northern France, British units found themselves dozens of kilometers from the previous day's battlefield. But fatigue clung to every step. Many soldiers had gone nearly 3 days with almost no sleep, fighting, marching, and fighting again without pause. Boots caked with mud, shoulders raw from straps, and throats scorched by powder smoke. None of it could slow them. They knew stopping meant destruction. If they halted, the Germans would crush them without mercy. Behind them, scattered clashes erupted throughout the countryside. German cavalry units tried repeatedly to swing around the flanks or race ahead to block the BEF's path. Sharp, brutal firefights broke out along hedgerows, village lanes, and small woodlots. But even in exhaustion, the British fought with astonishing resolve. A single platoon of trained riflemen could hold off an entire German battalion for hours, thanks to marksmanship skills unmatched anywhere in Europe. By August 28th, the retreat had become the greatest test the BEF had faced since landing in France. A steady rain turned the roads slick, and many columns were forced to navigate intersections clogged with refugees, thousands fleeing in wagons or on foot, carrying whatever possessions they could. British soldiers maintained formation while also helping civilians escape the advancing war. Those scenes would later become symbols of the bond between the British Army and the people of France during their darkest hours. Generals Haig and Smith-Dorrien sent urgent reports warning that the BEF risked being split in two. Meanwhile, General von Kluck, determined to finish off the BEF as quickly as possible, pushed his forces southward with a relentless drive, hoping to trap the British near St. Quentin. But here, the BEF proved its remarkable adaptability. While the Germans assumed the British would retreat straight toward Paris, the BEF abruptly shifted direction, slipping through forest tracks and back roads to avoid being cornered. Night marches guided only by moonlight and creased field maps became the key to their survival. On August 29th, BEF units finally crossed the Oise River, a critical turning point. The Germans had been delayed just long enough for the gap between the two armies to widen. Behind the British, bridges were blown apart, preventing the Germans from bringing forward large forces quickly. Yet even after reaching this temporary safety, the British could not rest. The entire Allied line was withdrawing southward, preparing for what would become a decisive showdown near the Marne. Still, the retreat was not merely flight. At several points, the BEF mounted fierce rearguard actions to slow the German advance. Some small companies were ordered to hold as long as possible, and they did so with extraordinary courage. A handful of men would stay behind, firing until overrun, fully aware that every minute they bought was a minute their comrades gained to escape. In those days, the BEF experienced the brutality of modern war in full. Fragmented logistics, abandoned artillery pieces, disrupted communication. Yet despite all this, the force remained intact, a cohesive, disciplined army. Even the German high command was baffled. In several German reports, officers complained that the British retreat, but they never collapse, making rapid pursuit far more difficult than expected. On the night of August 30th, the BEF received word that the French were facing an even greater threat to the east. A massive German thrust was driving straight toward Paris. If the city fell, the entire Allied front would crumble. And so the BEF, exhausted, bloodied, and worn thin, continued its orderly withdrawal to join the French in defending the capital. On August 31st, the BEF linked up with French forces near the Marne. Their hollow-cheeked faces, dust-covered uniforms, and bloodshot eyes stunned French commanders, who had not believed such a small force could survive Mons, Le Cateau, and nearly a week of relentless retreat. Yet they had not only survived, they remained disciplined, cohesive, and ready to fight again. Their arrival at the Marne was pivotal. Together with General Joffre's forces, the BEF would soon halt the German war machine in the battle that would decide the fate of Europe. Without the BEF's tenacious retreat from Mons to the Marne, they would never have stood on that battlefield. And so, as dusk fell on August 31st across the fields of the Marne, British soldiers finally sat down, drinking their first full sip of water in hours, reflecting on the fiery path they had carved to reach this moment. They had been cornered, hunted, and hammered by the German steel sledgehammer. They had fought and withdrawn and fought. But they had not been destroyed. They were still here. A small, unyielding force, ready for the next battle. And ahead of them, history waited. The Battle of Mons was not merely the BEF's first engagement. It was the birth of their legend, written in blood, endurance, and unshakable courage. The Battle of Mons in 1914 closed as a heroic overture to the grueling journey the BEF would endure on the battlefields of Europe. The British soldiers, few in number but rich in discipline and iron resolve, held their ground against the overwhelming force of the mighty German army, then executed a masterful fighting withdrawal that military historians still speak of today. Mons was not a victory, but it was a testament to unbreakable spirit. a declaration that Britain would not yield to any war machine. From Mons to the Marne, these men helped shift the fate of Europe through nothing more than endurance, determination, and sheer courage. What are your thoughts on the Battle of Mons, the first clash that carried the British Army into World War I legend? Share your reflections below, and don't forget to subscribe to follow more epic and faithfully recreated historical battles.